del programa Aula Árabe.
The Aula Árabe Universitaria program, which is entitled Political Islam in Crisis, Lessons from the Post-Revolutionary Arab World. And this is an event that is being held in partnership, in a partnership between Casa Árabe and the South European Studies Master's Program of the Autonomous University of Madrid. As you know, we're going to hear from Stéphane Lacroix, who's an associate professor of political science at Sciences Po and a researcher in the Centre de Recherches Internationales de Sciences Po. And we're also here with Walid Salih, who is a lecturer of Arabic and Islamic Studies of the Autonomous University of Madrid. And so we would like to welcome both of them to this event, and all of you would like to thank you for attending in person here in our hall in Madrid, but also our YouTube channel, where you can follow this in both English and Spanish. For those of you who wish to listen to the simultaneous translation here in this hall, you can go and collect some headphones now before we begin. Okay, so we're going to start talking about this political Islam, which possibly for you is something you probably connect with the post-revolutionary period after the Arab revolutions of 2010, 2011, which is when this became visible internationally, particularly because of its impacts on various elections. It became increasingly key, not just for the Arab countries themselves and their political evolution, but also for this side of the Mediterranean, where leaders had to deal with new political leadership and definitely new political programs in such important countries as Egypt or Tunisia and Morocco. For example, where in 2011, the Justice and Development Party obtained a simple majority in the elections to the Moroccan parliament. We'll also speak about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, about Naqda in Tunisia. And so we're very interested in understanding what this political Islam is and how this new leaderships have reached power, and also how they've then lost ground, in some cases, rather spectacularly. And of course, the usual question, looking into the future, what can we expect from the future? And to do that, we have our visionary today, Stéphane Lacroix, who's an associate professor of political science at Sciences Po. And Stéphane has worked on politics and religion, focused on the Gulf and Egypt. He's published Awakening Islam, the Politics of Religious Dissent in Contemporary Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian Transition, Insights on Social, Political and Economic Religious Change, and Egypt's Revolution, Politics, Revolution and Social Movements, amongst others. Don't want to take any more of their time, so because you're all here to listen to Stéphane Lacroix. Afterwards, we will have some comments or reactions from Walid Saleh, and then later we will open the discussion and hear your questions and comments for our guest or key note speaker today. Please remember to use your face masks at all times. We're only going to take them off when it's our turn to speak, and so I'm going to put mine back on straight away if I can find it. And now I'm going to give the floor to Stéphane, please. And Stéphane actually speaks pretty good Spanish, but he's going to give his lecture in English. Thank you very much, Karim. And yes, I'm going to speak in English during my presentation, but actually for the questions, if you wish, you can ask me in Spanish, because I can understand Spanish, so I can reply in Spanish or English, whatever you prefer. It's actually, I think, easier for the terminology for me to speak in English, and that's why I'm going to give my lecture in English.
about political Islam and the fate of political Islam. If you look at the last 10 years in the Arab world, there's been a dramatic turn of events. 10 years ago, the Islamists seemed to be on the verge of seizing power everywhere, right? And it was the case in Egypt and in Tunisia, and there was a feeling that it wouldn't take very long for Islamists to become the new ideological force in the region. 10 years after, things seem very different. At this point, political Islam is in probably the worst crisis of its history. So those 10 years have seen this dramatic turn of events, and what I'm interested in is to try to understand what happened, right? So my three questions are really, why were Islamists so strong in 2011? What happened for them to enter in this crisis? And is this crisis permanent? What to expect for the future, right? So those are my three questions. Before I start, let me just say a word about political Islam and what it is. I imagine some of you have already some idea, but I want to make sure that everyone understands what we are talking about. Political Islam is an ideology that developed in the Arab world, starting in the late 19th century, that formalized in the 20th century. And that is the result of the global changes of the 19th century that saw a massive decline of the Arab world versus Europe, a wave of colonization of Europe in the Arab world, the introduction of Western modernity, most of the time by force, into the Arab world. And all of this produced a number of political reactions in the Arab world, right? So there was a debate on the decline. What went wrong? Why, did this glorious civilization at this point seemed to be completely subordinate to the Europeans? The Arabs couldn't stop the onslaught of the Europeans. Now the Europeans were colonizing the region. They were imposing political systems on the region. And so this produced a number of political reactions, right? Which basically formed the basis of contemporary Arab political ideologies. And the main divide was between those who believed that European modernity, Western modernity was the way to go, that one could take inspiration from Western modernity, and so those people would import Western political ideologies, communism, socialism, forms of nationalism. Arab nationalism was especially one of the strong ones. On the other hand, there were people who thought that the solution was to be found in Islam, that the reason of the decline was not the lack of European modernity. The reason for the decline was that Muslims were not Muslim enough, and that they had to return to the essence of religion to find solutions to their problems, and that only through a return to the essence of religion would they be able to reconnect with the glorious past. So this, is the beginning of that kind of reflection over identity, right? Again, is Islam the core of identity, and is Islam the core of the political project? Or should we instead look towards Western modernity? Those who looked for solutions in Islam are broadly what is known as political Islam, right? Those who believe that Islam was the blueprint for the Renaissance, right? And the Renaissance was the big theme, and Nahda, for those of you who know the words in Arabic of that period. And so for these people, Islam was the solution, right? And Islam is the solution. Al-Islam wal-Hal would become the slogan of one of those groups, the Muslim Brotherhood. So that was the idea of political Islam that formed political Islam. And again, you can trace those ideas back to the late 19th century, and they start to crystallize in the 20th century around a number of groups. There are basically three main factions in political Islam, if you want to divide very roughly, right? The first is the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And that formed in 1928 in Egypt. It was established by a teacher, Hassan al-Banna. And the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood was that the solution was political. That is, it was through the establishment of an Islamic political system that Muslims could find a solution. Of course, this was not long after the fall of the caliphate, right, or the abolition of the caliphate in Turkey, when Mustafa Kemal Atatürk came to power in the early 1920s, when, after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was no more. And so in a sense, there was, Muslim Brotherhood was a reaction to the fall of the caliphate by trying to propose a Muslim and Islamic political system that would replace the caliphate, right? And the idea was, again, that by establishing an Islamic political system, that would be the solution. Muslims would be able to reconnect with their former glories. That system was called the Islamic State, Dawla al-Islamiyya, and that became the slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood and of many subsequent Islamic groups, until the very last one in Iraq and Syria, which actually called itself the Islamic State. But the notion of the Islamic State actually goes back to the 1920s, right? What is an Islamic state? It's a state based on Sharia, right? And this is how they define it, right? It's a state based on Sharia, that is, whose law is Islamic law. So the Muslim Brotherhood proposed a political solution to the problem of decline. And their solution was the establishment of a specific political system. Over time, the project of the Muslim Brotherhood would evolve and would, engage with political developments. From the 1980s, the Muslim Brotherhood would say that their project is not contradictory with a democracy. Their enemies wouldn't believe them. Their enemies would say they're just saying this because, they're trying to look good. But gradually, the Muslim Brotherhood would kind of, adapt its rhetoric, at least, to the changes in global politics. And in the late 20th century, the Muslim Brotherhood would rather speak of what they call a civil state with an Islamic reference. That would become the big phrase, الدولة المدنية بمرجعية إسلامية. It would become the new, kind of the replacement for the old idea of the Islamic State. But of course, the idea of Sharia was still central to that project, right? The Muslim Brotherhood started in Egypt, but it spread across the region, and actually across the world, in Muslim minorities across the world. So you basically have, in most Muslim countries, and in most countries with a Muslim minority, you do have a group that takes its inspiration from the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And this was the case in all of the countries of the Arab world. Sometimes they were called Muslim Brotherhoods, sometimes they weren't. In Tunisia, they took the name Nahda in 1987, but they were from the same school, intellectually speaking, right? They pertain to the same political tradition of the Muslim Brotherhood. So that is the first group of political Islam, right? The Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliates. The second group are the Salafis. And the Salafis trace their origins back to Saudi Arabia and to the pre-modern period, actually, the 18th century. But the Salafis really experienced a moment of intense growth in the second half of the 20th century across the world. Salafis believe that the solution is to be found in Islam as well, but they believe that what matters is to transform individuals. So for Salafis, the solution is social. It is not political. It is to transform societies, to make individuals better Muslims, of course, as they understand Islam, and it's a very conservative understanding of Islam. But usually the Salafis are not very interested in big politics. They believe that, again, solution comes from below and not from above. There is nothing to expect from changing the state if you haven't transformed individuals before. And once society has become Salafi, then, a solution will be found. So in that sense, the Salafis always shunned politics. They were not interested. Their main methods was da'wah, preaching, right? The third group emerged after the 1960s, and they're the jihadis. Basically, they have more or less the same objectives as the Muslim Brotherhoods, but they advocate violent methods. They believe that the Islamic State can be achieved through revolutionary violence, right? So in that sense, for them, the use of violence is legitimate in overthrowing the non-Muslim state and establishing the Islamic State, right? And jihadis would later, expand the list of their enemies, include the United States and the West. That was in the 1990s. But again, the main idea of the jihadis that distinguished them from the other groups was the use of violence, right? And the legitimate use of violence from their perspective. They formed different groups. Al-Qaeda, of course, was the first of them. And later on, the Islamic State, Daesh, right? So those are the three main factions of political Islam, and you can see that they differ in their objectives and their methods. But in the end, they all agree that Islam is the solution, right? That's what kind of brings them together. Throughout the 20th century, Islamists experienced a gradual growth, in their appeal, right? Many of the groups formed, the Muslim Brotherhood formed in the 1920s. Salafis, as I said, experienced, a large growth in the second half of the 20th century. Although Salafis were also there before, in Egypt, for instance, the first Salafi group was actually established in 1926. So they also have a long history. Jihadis come into the history a little bit later, as we saw. But the 1970s were really, a moment of massive growth for the Islamists. And the 1970s is really, sometimes seen as the turning point, right, in the rise of Islamists. The Islamists themselves actually call that moment the Sahwa al-Islamiyya, the Islamic awakening, right? And this is a term which they use to refer to the decade of the 1970s. So why the 1970s? There's a number of reasons. I don't want to get into all of them. Of course, one of them is the decline of other ideologies, right? I mean, the secular ideologies that had taken hold after independence hadn't delivered. Arab nationalism, socialism were not providing the types of political responses that people were expecting. They promised a lot, those secular regimes, when they came to power after independence, and they didn't deliver much. They promised development, they promised prosperity, they promised to unite the Arab nation, they promised that they would win wars against Israel, and they did none of this. So in a sense, Islamism appeared to be, the last remaining ideological alternative to those failed secular ideologies, and that explained why many people actually turned to Islam as, again, or to political Islam, as, because they were seeking responses that they couldn't find in the other ideologies. There is one more factor that I should mention quickly, which is the rise of economic liberalism in the 1970s. And I think that's crucial as well. I mean, the 1970s is really the liberal turn in the Arab world, economically speaking. The states that were established post-independence were mostly, socialist across the Arab world. I mean, they believed in the welfare state. They believed in providing services to the population. The state was, overwhelming, right? After the 1970s, and it starts with Sadat in Egypt, and then it spreads across the world, the Arab world, the state retreats to its security functions, right? And the state spends less and less in social services. So it is the beginning of the end of the welfare state, in a sense, right? And what the state does now is repression, basically, but it doesn't provide the way it did. So the more the state retreats, the less the state provides social services, the more it opens a space for other actors to provide social services. And that space would be filled by those different Islamic groups we talked about, right? So in that sense, much of the appeal also of these Islamist groups, Muslim Brotherhood, Salafis, was also because they could fill the void that was left by the retreat of the state, right? And that was the case, again, all across the region. So those groups continued to grow from the 1970s and 80s and 90s, right? In the 2000s, actually, if you look at the political scene and the social scene in the Arab world, Islamists are leading everywhere. I mean, in Egypt and across the region, it is obvious that the Muslim Brotherhood is the #1 opposition to political regimes. And before the Arab Spring, anyone who knows the region would tell you that if you have a free and fair election, in almost any country in the region, the Muslim Brotherhood will win. The Salafis also, through their social preaching, have also gained enormous ground. I mean, in the 2000s, if you went to Egypt, you would probably, hear Salafi TV channels everywhere. I mean, you just enter the shop, and if the TV was on, you probably have a Salafi preacher on TV telling you about the torments of the grave and the end of days and the necessity to, be a super pious Muslim, otherwise you will go to hell. So all of that rhetoric was very, very socially strong in the 2000s as well. And TV channels, actually, the liberalization of the media also proved of great help to the type of preaching that groups such as the Salafis were doing. So the 2000s is really a decade in which you kind of see that strength. Well, the jihadis started the decade quite strong, and that was the reason for the attacks of 9/11 in the United States. Later on, the jihadis actually, were weakened by all the counterterrorism campaigns launched against them. So by the late 2000s, the jihadis are actually probably the only group that are actually slightly on the decline. I mean, they have a strong base in Yemen, they have a strong base in the Sahel region, but still, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis are much stronger at this point, right? When 2011 happens then, when the Arab Spring happens, of course, this is a moment when those Islamist groups are actually, as I said, in a dominant position. Although the paradox here is that the Islamist groups have nothing to do with the Arab Spring itself. I mean, in all of the countries, the revolutions of late 2010 and the beginning of 2011 were started by mostly youth groups, social movements sometimes, workers' movements in the case of Tunisia, that were mostly non-ideological, right? Those revolutions were started from a non-ideological basis. It was about social demands, it was about social justice, it was about having jobs and having something to eat. It was about the end of political repression, which people were suffering. But it was not ideologically motivated. But as soon as the revolutions succeeded, and in the countries where a transitional period started with elections, the Islamists were the ones who were in the best position to win. Because again, winning elections is very different from making a revolution. Winning elections is about, having a social and political infrastructure on the ground, which you can mobilize to get people to vote, to win votes. Again, social services would play a major role. The mosques, as a kind of natural base for these Islamist movements, would play a role. And all the other non-Islamist factions wouldn't have that much of a social base at this point, right? So the Islamists started with a massive advantage, and they would translate that massive advantage into victories. And so, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood won. Both the parliamentary elections, they came first with 45% in 2011, and the presidential election in 2012, which they won. And Mohamed Morsi became the president of Egypt. In Tunisia, it was the same thing, right? In 2011, you had the first elections for a constitutional assembly, and again, Ennahda came first. The Muslim Brotherhood actually managed to exert influence even in countries where you didn't go through that election phase. I mean, if you take Syria, for instance, although, the fight was still ongoing between the regime and the opposition, but if you look at the bodies that represented the Syrian opposition, such as the Syrian National Council, you'd see that the Islamists actually and the Muslim Brotherhood had a lot of influence over the council. So at this point, and you could say the same thing about Yemen, you could say the same thing about Libya. So at this point, in all of these transitional structures, the Muslim Brotherhood exerted massive influence. And it was not only the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way. One of the surprises of 2011 was that the Salafis decided to do politics, and it was the case in Egypt in particular. The Salafis had always been uninterested in politics. They'd always been, they didn't have a political party. They said, we don't do politics. But in 2011, the Salafis understood that it was a good thing for them to have a political representation. So the main Salafi religious group actually created a political party in Egypt. It was called Hizb al-Nur, the Party of Light. Nur means light, as you probably know. And they came second in the elections, 25%. So in the parliamentary elections of Egypt, actually you have 70%, a block of 70%, which is Muslim Brotherhood plus Salafis. So it's quite a huge majority in the case of Egypt that you have for Islamists. So, you know, even in countries, by the way, that didn't have their own revolution, think of Morocco, for instance, and Karim mentioned that. I mean, although in Morocco, you know, the system never fell, the king was kind of smart enough to understand that, you know, Islamists were on the rise. So, you know, it's the moment to appoint an Islamist prime minister. Of course, as you know, in Morocco, the system also very much depends on what the king allows, you know, the political space to do. So in that case, you know, it was the king's decision to allow for the appointment of a prime minister from the winning party in the 2011 elections, which was not the case before. Usually the prime minister didn't need to be appointed from the winning party. But this time it was the case, and it happened that the winning party in the 2011 Moroccan elections was the PJD, so the Justice and Development Party. And so in Morocco as well, you did have an Islamist prime minister. So at this point, you know, this is what this moment of Islamist hegemony that I talk about, right? That moment wouldn't last for very long. And in 2013, it's really the beginning of the backlash, right? So, you know, in a sense, you know, this moment of Islamist euphoria kind of lasted for 2 years, right? 2013 is really the beginning of the backlash. And the backlash would start in 2013 and continue in the subsequent years. Of course, the beginning of the backlash is epitomized by what happens in Egypt and the coup by the Egyptian army and Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi against Mohamed Morsi on the 3rd of July 2013. And that is the beginning of a massive backlash against the Muslim Brotherhood across the region and more generally against all Islamist groups. What are the reasons for this? I mean, I think you can really you can name 3 reasons, right, for that backlash. One reason has to do with the Islamists themselves. I mean, when you look at the Muslim Brotherhood, they had a lot of slogans, but they didn't seem to have a very clear idea of what they actually wanted to do. I mean, there's a difference between using the phrase Islamic State, which sounds good, and, you know, actually transforming it into a concrete political program, having a concrete political vision. And it appeared that the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, and the joke in Egypt at the time was the Muslim Brotherhood are great at winning elections. That's what they know how to do. You know, they know how to win an election. They have no idea how to govern a country. And, I mean, that was partly the case, right? You know, they were a new political elite. They didn't know how to manage a country. They projected an image of incompetence. They also, you know, got involved in many of the scandals that all the other parties were involved in. I mean, when you are in the opposition, you can appear as the white knight, you know, that, you know, has all the solutions and is not corrupt. When you enter politics, and that would especially affect the Nahda in Tunisia later on, you know, you start to actually become like all the others, you know. So you may, you know, have this great rhetoric in the opposition, but when you actually test it politically, you actually do not have more to offer than the others, and you tend to be drawn into the same political system as all the others, and this ends up affecting you. In the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, it was also, and this kind of affected many of the Islamist parties, you know, the return to identity politics. And in a sense, I've told you how the divide between the Islamists and the others, if you go back 100 years, was all about identity, right? Is our political identity rooted in Islam, or can we root our political identity elsewhere? After 2011, the main debate, and the Islamists would fuel that debate, is a debate of identity, right? So in Egypt, instead of talking about actually how to provide concrete solutions to people's concrete problems, the whole debate was about where do we put Islam in the constitution and how much Sharia, and in a sense it sounded completely disconnected from what a lot of people actually expected from those revolutions. And in a sense, the Islamists, especially in Egypt, very much fed into that. I think they fed into that because they believed that they could gain a political majority through that identity discourse. Especially because in Egypt, the Islamists were competing with the Salafis. And that is something that, is very peculiar about Egypt. The fact that in Egypt you didn't have only one Islamist party that was strong, you had two. And the nightmare of the Muslim Brotherhood was that the Salafis would, constantly accuse them of not being religious enough. So the Muslim Brotherhood were constantly trying to play identity politics in order not to let the Salafis take identity away from them. So in that sense, it kind of drew the Muslim Brotherhood in that camp and fed into the polarization that would eventually lead to their demise. The same remark can be used in other contexts, although in Tunisia, the Islamists, probably because they didn't have a Salafi competitor that could, draw them towards the right, were much smarter in the way they dealt with those identity politics. Although there was a lot of identity politics in Tunisia as well. So that is the first reason, right? It's, the Islamists' internal problems were one of the reasons why they fell. But it's obviously not the only reasons. The Islamists also had to face, in all of these countries, what political scientists have called the deep state. I mean, in a sense, one of the limits of those Arab revolutions was that they got away with the dictator, but they didn't get away with the system. And one of the big problems in a country like Egypt was that, Mubarak was more than Mubarak. I mean, Mubarak was a system. And a lot of that system, even after Mubarak left, actually remained. The same judges who'd been appointed by Mubarak remained judges after 2011. The same constitutional court appointed by Mubarak remained the constitutional court. The same police appointed by Mubarak and the same police generals appointed by Mubarak remained the police generals. The same military officers and military generals remained the military generals. So in that sense, the whole system remained. Mubarak left, but the system was there. So when Morsi was elected, he found himself at the head of a state that hated him. And a lot of what the state did against Morsi during the year when Morsi was in power was actually to try to sabotage him. I mean, of course, one could argue that the Muslim Brotherhood were quite good at sabotaging themselves, but the deep state was also there to sabotage them. And in a sense, the more the Muslim Brotherhood dig into the identity politics and the polarization, the deep state would use that against them. So in that sense, you also have to take into account, the resistance of the deep states. Again, Egypt is the paradigm here. But in Tunisia, you did have a lot of that, a lot of resistance from the Tunisian deep state. I mean, imagine that to be a military general or a police officer under Mubarak, hating the Muslim Brotherhood was a criteria for promotion. So the more you hated the Muslim Brotherhood, the higher you would go in the hierarchy. So the people who actually led those security bodies were people who were actually there because they hated the Muslim Brotherhood. So how do you expect them to serve a Muslim Brotherhood president? So in that sense, the Muslim Brotherhood were also, the victim of something that was bigger than them. And not just internally bigger than them, but regionally bigger than them. Because 2013 is also the year of the beginning of what you could call the regional counter-revolution. I mean, when there's a revolution, there's always a counter-revolution happening, right? It's a historical law. And that counter-revolution would start from some of the Gulf monarchies that were the most threatened in 2011 by the Arab Spring, and that would gradually, engage in a region-wide effort to try to stop the advance of revolutions, and more specifically, to try to stop the Islamists, because they came to the conclusion, which was right, that, revolutions bring Islamists to power. So, you need to stop revolutions, you need to stop Islamists, and especially Muslim Brotherhood types. So those countries were the United Arab Emirates, of course, and Saudi Arabia. Those were the two first countries that engaged in that counter-revolution. And, it was a little bit, if you think of 19th century Europe, it was the Congress of Vienna, right? 1815, trying to stop the advance of the French revolutionary ideas. And you could say, if you want to use that historical metaphor, that Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates is the Metternich, of the Arab world. He's the one coordinating the counter-revolutionary effort. And those countries would actually have a major role also in the demise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I mean, at this point, historically, we know that the Egyptian army was very much in conversation with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia before it conducted the coup. And the coup in Egypt also happened with the blessing of those two countries. And the regime that came to power in Cairo in 2013, with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as the leader, was heavily funded by the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. They've actually paid, until now, more than $50 billion to keep Egypt, afloat. So, in that sense, it was, the coup that happened in Egypt was not only an Egyptian story, it was also a regional story, right, in that battle between revolutionary and counter-revolutionary forces. And after, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood fell in Egypt, Egypt would become the third part of this kind of counter-revolutionary triangle, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Facing that triangle, and you would have two countries that actually decided to help the Islamists. So all of this kind of turned at some point into a regional Cold War, with Qatar and Turkey on the one hand, helping the Muslim Brotherhood especially, and more generally, the Islamists. And on the other hand, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE fighting a war everywhere against Islamists. In 2014, by the way, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, the three of them, declared the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. Again, and this was very much a political decision on part of those three countries. So Qatar and Turkey helped the Islamists because, again, in the case of Turkey, it was mostly because of some type of ideological, proximity between Erdogan, or Erdogan came from a movement that was in thinking close to the Muslim Brotherhood, although the AKP, was not the Turkish branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, but in his own political history, Erdogan came from that political tradition. In the case of Qatar, it was more, a logic of interest. Qatar decided to bet on the Arab Spring as a way to try to expand its influence after 2011, and especially on the Islamists, since Qatar had ancient ties with the Muslim Brotherhood and believed that it was a good way to try to expand its influence. But eventually, of course, the enemies of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists would prove to be much stronger than their allies, and you could see that. In the way Saudi Arabia and the UAE, supported General Khalifa Haftar in Libya. It was this general who rose in the east against the revolutionary government of Libya, which was a mess, by the way. Not to say that the revolutionary government was anything functional in Libya, but Khalifa Haftar, presented himself as the Libyan Sisi, and that was, a secular man who was willing to put things in order in Libya, and he did so with the backing of those counter-revolutionary states. In countries like Tunisia, there was a lot of funding from the UAE for Nida Tunis, which was the political coalition that formed against the Nahda. So, all of this became a regional game at some point, right? And you did have a number of determined actors in the Gulf who were willing to put an end to the revolutionary wave, to criminalize the Islamists as the main opposition force, and to restore the authoritarian status quo in the region, right? Because in the end, it was all about restoring the authoritarian status quo in the region. The only exception was Syria, right? And Syria is a little bit of an outlier here, because those countries also hated Iran very much. And in the case of Syria, they supported the Syrian revolution not because they liked revolutions, but because they hated Iran even more than they hated revolutions. So they made kind of an exception for Syria. But in the rest of the region, their policies were very much geared at trying to restore the authoritarian status quo. In a sense, the rise of ISIS, the rise of Tanzim al-Dawla, the organization of the Islamic State, in Syria and Iraq after 2013 has a lot to do with those dynamics, right? Of course, the beginnings of the Islamic State in Iraq especially, is very much an Iraqi history, right? At the beginning, it's, you know, it's the outcome of the American invasion of Iraq, the marginalization of Sunnis, the empowerment of Shia, the radicalization of the Sunni insurgency in Iraq. So at the beginning, all of this is an Iraqi story. But with the Arab Spring, that organization finds an opportunity to expand into Syria. And after 2013, those jihadis start to find a lot of support across the Arab world. I mean, in a way, I mean, 2011 was widely seen by the jihadis as a catastrophe, right? Because jihadis had always tried to prove that change could only come through violence, that there was no way but the way of weapons. When in 2011, change happens through peaceful means. Jihadis seem to be, you know, at the beginning, proven wrong. So when the Muslim Brotherhood is overthrown by force in Egypt, and with all the subsequent massacres in Egypt, the jihadis can now say, we told you so from the beginning. And the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, were always enemies of the jihadis in that sense. The jihadis heavily criticized the Muslim Brotherhood for engaging in normal politics, and that goes a long way back. So the jihadis would tell, you know, the militants, we told you so. You know, and you believed in that democratic game, and now look at what happens to you. So in that sense, you know, the jihadi dynamic would benefit enormously from the failure of the Arab Spring, but also from the failure of these Islamists who tried to govern in those countries. And that would feed into the narrative of ISIS very much. That would feed into the recruitment of ISIS, where you would see, I mean, Egyptians and Tunisians, etc., going into Syria and Iraq in great numbers. Of course, ISIS also fed into the rhetoric of the counter-revolutionary states. I mean, for the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, it was actually the proof that the Muslim Brotherhood and the jihadis were the same thing. You know, there's only one group and they're all terrorists. And so in a sense, you know, they would also facilitate the ultra-authoritarian rhetoric of those countries, who would now openly, you know, just blend everyone together and openly, you know, criminalize everyone and use purely repressive methods against all these groups. And, well, ISIS was kind of short-lived. You know, it was destroyed, at least partially in 2017. It might come back in the future. But at this point, you know, they lost the territory that they once controlled. But all of this is kind of fed into that return of the authoritarian Arab state in the region. So today, authoritarian states in the region are actually more authoritarian than they were before 2011. I mean, if you compare, you know, the two, and we were actually saying that with Karim before, you know, the people in Egypt actually, you know, look at the days of Mubarak with some form of nostalgia, you know. At least under Mubarak, you know, you did have some political space. It was constrained, but it was there. In Egypt today, anything slightly political or not, you know, not even political, anything that seems to move ideas, seems to mobilize people in any way, is seen immediately as a threat by the regime. And the regime goes a long way, you know, in arresting TikTok influencers, for instance, which, you know, is crazy. You know, even girls, you know, or having following on TikTok, you know, are seen as a threat at this point. And what they do is dance. They don't talk about politics. So at this point, you know, the regimes are so paranoid. And in a sense, they are paranoid because one lesson they've learned is that if you open a little bit of space, a revolution can happen. So let no space, right? So the regimes today in the Arab world are much more repressive than they ever were. And, or at least, you know, you have to go back to the 1950s to find equally repressive regimes. So what does that say for Islamists today? Well, I think one of the reasons why Islamists today seemed, you know, nowhere to be found. I mean, if you look at, you know, the debates in the Arab world today, Islamists have never been so silent, right? Is it because Islamists, you know, and you know about these theories about the decline of political Islam and the failure of political Islam, you know, and French political scientists have been writing about this since the 1990s, for those of you who know Gilles Kepel and Olivier Roy. So is it finally the failure, or is it finally the decline of political Islam? I think at this point it would be very premature to say that. Of course, you know, today Islamists have lost quite a bit of credit in the populations, right? I think that in a sense, there is a tendency among the populations of the region to blame Islamists for many things that went wrong. And it's been very much also, a narrative that has been constructed by Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the UAE. And in Egypt, when something goes wrong, it's a Muslim Brotherhood conspiracy. At this point, it's become a joke, right? When there's a train crash in Egypt, the next day, all the newspapers say, Muslim Brotherhood conspiracy to crash Egyptian trains. So at this point, but this kind of works, And it also works because indeed, when the Islamists were in power, they didn't leave very good memories. So at this point, yes, the Islamists have certainly lost that type of reputation which they had, People saw them as, a group with solutions, as a group with, that was not corrupt, all of this in a sense, and speak to Tunisians, you also hear a lot of that, the Tunisians tend to look at Nahda as equally corrupt as all the others. So at this point, they've lost a little bit of that political virginity, right? It has cost them, in a sense. And the association to violence also has cost them, right? Although again, ISIS was not the Muslim Brotherhood, but the regimes have been repeating for the last 7 years that it's the same thing. And in a sense, it has also had an impact on the broader Islamist movement. But at the same time, the reason why we don't see Islamists today is because we don't see anyone. That is, at this point, oppositions in the Arab world are silenced. I mean, there's actually few countries in the Arab world that retain some measure of civil society where you can actually have a lively political debate. It's becoming more and more difficult. In Egypt, there's none. And gradually, even in countries that used to be much more liberal in the past, you see the political space shrinking today. And it's the case, obviously, in countries like Saudi Arabia, where actually I've worked on Saudi Arabia, and you might be surprised to know that in the 2000s, there was political debate in Saudi Arabia. There's none today, right? I mean, and of course, when you have a political leader who cuts his opponents into pieces in foreign consulates, that kind of sends a message that you do not want to be on the wrong side. But even in countries like, think of Kuwait, think of Morocco, that used to be actually much more liberal countries, even there. There is an authoritarian backlash happening. So I think at this point also we should not be mistaken to think that because we don't hear any voices of dissent coming from the Arab world, that means that there's no Islamist anymore. It's just that there's no space for anyone to express themselves anymore. So to me, of course, I wouldn't think that at this point, I would think it's premature to say that it is the end of Islamists. And of course the reason is that the reasons that have produced Islamists in the first hand are still very much there. Identity politics haven't stopped, and those identity questions haven't been solved. The political and social problems that fueled the growth of Islamist movements are also very much there. Objectively speaking, the situation in the Arab world today is worse than it was 10 years ago. I mean, if you look at all the indicators, economic, political, it's worse. So if we believe that the same causes produce the same effects, there is absolutely no reason that this would stop. So in a sense, I think we should, of course, observe and wait, and we should not make hasty judgments. But again, I believe that, the Islamists, this is not the end of Islamists, and we'll see them reappear in other forms. And until that region has managed to overcome not only those identity politics problems, but many of the social and political problems that have fueled into them, it won't be the moment to claim that political Islam is dead. Thank you very much, and yeah, that's it for me.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Stéphane Lacroix, for this overview. I think we've managed to see the origins of political Islam. This started in 1928 in Egypt, that is 1 century ago. So we've seen the rise of these movements and the quick fall of such movements. And as you said, this is not the end. Muslim brothers will continue to be strong because they have been censored and they have been forced to work underground, but they will probably rise again, perhaps elsewhere. I'm sure there will be many questions from the audience. Now the floor is yours, Professor. Thank you. I would like to thank Casa Árabe for the invitation. Your speech was very interesting, Professor Lacroix. I'd like to begin with a few remarks regarding Professor Lacroix's talk and regarding other topics too. The term political Islam, according to scholars, it was first used by Indian Muslims, such as the case of Khazar, and then it is used by Rashid Ibad, a very known Islamist, disciple of Muhammad Aslud, a great reformist of Islam, as is considered by some scholars. And then this term, political Islam, becomes widespread with the foundation of the Muslim Brothers in 1928. It is important to keep in mind that Egypt in the 30s and in the 40s, as well as afterwards for many decades, was a destination of many people that were studying at university. So people would meet Muslim brothers at university and would start to know their ideology, and then when they went back to their countries, they started to form groups of Muslim brothers in Iraq, Algeria, Morocco, and in other countries. As a matter of fact, there are groups of Muslim brothers in many other places, such as in Kuwait, and Muslim brothers are in the parliament in this country with a lot of strength, and in Jordan as well. I don't know if I agree with Professor Lacroix when he said that Muslim brothers were never violent, because when you look at their texts, you can see that some of them became jihadis, like the Jihad group, and most of them are offspring of the group of Muslim brothers. And we also know that Muslim brothers in Egypt have used social violence, at least social violence. Apostasy, for example, against anyone who is in disagreement with them is violence. Apostasy in Muslim countries is punished with execution. 13 out of the 57 countries in which there is a Muslim majority execute people that get away from Islam. Another important point that has to be kept in mind is that there were socialist regimes in Egypt, in Syria, in Iran, and at a certain point they started to get closer to Islamists, as we saw in the latest stage of Saddam's after the invasion of Kuwait. Saddam Hussein at the time starts to use a system called Asasa, that is a campaign. They got very close to Muslims and tried to include symbols in their flag as well in order to get closer to Islamists. With Sadat, the same situation takes place. They started to call him the president, the loyal president, or the president who is the believer, Sadat, and then he was murdered by Islamists themselves, by a jihadi group, which is part of the Muslim Brothers.
Injerencia.
But really the interference of some superpowers, especially the US, to a large extent to support the Islamists, as we saw, for instance, in the case of Afghanistan, as well as other places, in order to combat left-wing forces. And these left-wing forces were considered to be closer to the former Soviet Union. And so this struggle between the US and the former Soviet Union was essentially fought on that ground by supporting Islamists because they were against the Soviet atheists. And at the time, of course, we know how much support was given to Al-Qaeda and to the Taliban by the US for this reason, for no other reason. And speaking about the Islamist leaders, I think you mentioned at the end of your lecture the lack of credibility, the biggest problem, because Muslim countries have suffered greatly from this attitude, because when you read the texts and you read about their ideology and their behavior, and that's very important. It's not that Islamists or the Muslim Brotherhood didn't have the right to lead or to be in power. Quite the contrary. Currently, we have in the Arab world quite a few countries where they are in power, including Iran, and in Lebanon we have Hezbollah, Hassan Hezbollah, which is a state within a state. Hezbollah is actually the party that's governing Lebanon. Al-Bashir and Jafar al-Numeri before, for almost 30 years, were Islamists, and they were the leaders in Sudan and did apply Sharia. If a woman walked down the street in Western clothes, she would be arrested and punished. So you have to keep that in mind when speaking about the current reactions, because the lack of credibility remains today. Mursi, why 20 million Egyptians rallied against them until finally Sisi brought him down? Why? Why was that possible? What happened? Because Mursi acted a Haunat Dawla, as it's called in the Arab world, building a state that was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, because he placed all of his fellow Muslim Brotherhood members above the legislative power, and he passed a decree concentrating all power in his own hands. So he had executive and legislative power was in his hands. And then he opened the doors to other countries that were known to be well, the Egyptian people started to worry when they saw that he was having an excellent relationship with Iran and the Ayatollahs, for instance, and with Qatar as well. A lot of the former sheikhs who had fled returned to Egypt, even the ones that had been accused of assassinating Sadat. And the same happened with Turkey, and that made the Egyptian people start demonstrating against them. And in Tunisia, for example, when he flew in from London after having spent 22 years in exile, he was interviewed at the airport, and he said that he had no intention of having any of his candidates run for the presidency of Tunisia. And then when he was asked what he was going to do about drinking spirits and about women's clothing, he said that there would be no change and that Tunisia was a modern country and a tourist destination, and that he would not do anything that would go against that. And of course he did present a candidate for the presidential elections and eventually became the speaker of the house, and then his followers started chasing women down the street because they weren't wearing the hijab, and he tried to close the shops that were selling spirits, and so on and so forth. So that's something you have to keep in mind to understand why society has turned against these parties. When Ghanouchi got there in 2011, he got 89 seats in the Tunisian parliament. In 2014, they were down to 69. And in 2021, only 20 seats. Why was that? Why has there been this decline in their popularity? Well, because they have this underlying ideology which a lot of the people in these Muslim countries will not accept. Because Islamists, well, not all, of course, but there are some who accept modernity, who accept change, but I think the great majority of them have a completely archaic mindset, completely rooted in the past. Even what they wear, they immediately grow their beards and dress the Afghan style, and the way they speak, which is also completely archaic. They focus a lot more on appearance than on the essence of people's lives. And so the identity issue is definitely extremely important, because for decades, many decades in the Arab Islamic world, particularly in the Arab world, we've had two trends. On the one hand, some who are in favor of Islamiyya, the universality of Islam, and others who are in favor of pan-Arabism. That is, pan-Arabism which would include all citizens and not just Muslims, knowing that in countries like Egypt or Iraq or Syria, not everyone is Muslim. There are Christians, there are other religions, including the Yazidis, which have been persecuted in the war recently, and Jews too in many countries, including Morocco. And so the whole the Pan-Arab identity includes them all, especially because they have been defending the importance of a secular state, which is exactly the opposite of what the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists want, to have religion and power and state and religion fused into one. Those who believe in a secular state, of course, believe quite the opposite, in a separation between church and state, and to leave religion in their private sphere, in the mosque, at home, and the Arab identity would be the link between all the citizens. But I don't want to take up any more of your time. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Walid. Bueno, ha llegado la hora.
Thank you, Walid. And now we have time for questions. Some have come in through the YouTube channel already. And here also, we have a microphone. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll give you the microphone. But first, let's run through these questions that have come in. And we have until 7:30. So just to make sure that you keep your questions brief, and also try and make the answers brief. Question from Claudia Patricia Bueno, who's asking, what about the participation of women in political Islam? That's the first question, the participation of women in political Islam. And then Brian Acuna is asking whether it's possible for political Islam to have a resurgence in countries like Turkey or Qatar, those two allies that you mentioned, whether that could contribute to a resurgence of political Islam. And Marta Baranda is asking which of the three Islamist groups that you've described you would say is currently the most prominent. And so we're going to answer these three questions. And let's see how many hands are raised here. Just 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so let's answer these questions, and then we'll hear these 4 questions from the hall. Well, thank you very much, Karim. I didn't say it at the beginning, but I do want to thank Casa Árabe and yourself for the invitation to speak here. I meant to say that at the beginning, but I forgot. Anyway, to answer those three questions, well, as for the participation of women, let's say that these movements, the Muslim Brotherhood, do have women's sections, not the Salafists, or not so much. They are a lot more conservative, even with respect to the participation of women in the public sphere. The Muslim Brotherhood feel that women do have to be political actors, but within segregated structures. So their idea is that women can be in politics, but with women, and men with men, but they do mobilize women in the public sphere. Sometimes we saw it, for example, in the revolutions where the Muslim sisterhood did rally, but the concept was that women and men should not mingle, because when they mingle, that means temptation, and that can bring about, well, behaviors that are not Islamic. So it's a very conservative vision, but at least they do, they're not against the participation of women, as long as it's segregated. So they have evolved a little bit in some ways. In Egypt, for example, they did have some women candidates for parliament. There were some women MPs of the Islamic Brotherhood since the 2000s, and there was a big internal debate in the organization to decide whether women could run for parliament, but eventually they decided that they could. But of course the Salafist groups and the Noor party in Egypt refused, for example. And since there was a women's quota, they put all the women at the end of the list to make sure that none of them would get elected. And even that was a huge debate at the time in Egypt, because they drew up the list and they did not include the women's photographs, but a flower. The Muslim Brotherhood are calmer about that. They did have the photographs of the women candidates, and they did run, but in any case, they believe in a very conservative society for a very clear role for men and for women, and women can be political activists, but only amongst other women. So that's their vision. Less conservative, but still pretty conservative. And as for Turkey and Qatar and a potential resurgence of Islamist leadership in the rest of these countries, these two countries have supported the Muslim Brotherhood especially, and that has changed slightly in the last few years, because Erdogan in Turkey is a Turkish nationalist first and an Islamist second, and so he is currently redefining his priorities and Turkey's strategic priorities, and so he's now getting closer to old enemies. For a year or two now, he's been speaking to Egypt and to Sisi again and to Saudi Arabia. He needs investment from Saudi, and so he needs to diffuse that conflict, that sort of Cold War, that sort of counter-revolution that I described. So those things are calming down somewhat, and as a consequence, for example, the television channels that the Muslim Brotherhood had in Turkey, very critical with the Egyptian regime, had to stop featuring some leaders who were very critical with Sisi, for example, and that was part of that change in that relationship between Turkey and Egypt. And so at that point, the Muslim Brotherhood is still in Turkey. A lot of them are in exile in Turkey still, but they feel that Turkey no longer supports them as much as they did, as it was in the past. And Qatar, pretty much the same thing, because Qatar is now reconciling with Saudi. If you follow events after that boycott of Qatar, which was sort of the final stage of that conflict between these two axes, the Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates axis, and the Qatar-Turkey axis. So that boycott on Qatar by Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt was sort of the final stage of that conflict. And now it seems that they're rebuilding the relationship. And I think that that also has a lot to do with the fact that right now the Muslim Brotherhood does not really represent a threat for Sisi or for Saudi Arabia any longer. The Muslim Brotherhood has been weakened to such a point that they're no longer a credible threat. And for Turkey, they're no longer a group that is worth supporting because they have been weakened to such an extent. Why support them? Which does not mean they might not have a resurgence in the future again, but at this point, things are calming down quite a lot regionally between these countries. And so I don't think that Qatar's and Turkey's support is going to be a significant factor in a potential resurgence of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Muy brevemente, lo de los tres grupos.
Well, regarding the three groups, jihadis were always a very small group in favor of violence. Those in favor of violence have more success when there is no political success, when the political space is shut down, when there is no way to talk peacefully. Jihadis rise, such as in the case of Nasser's Egypt, when there was a lot of repression, and that situation allowed Daesh to rise the way it did. Therefore, jihadis were always a smaller group that is fueled by special circumstances like the ones we mentioned. Salafis are quite a strong group, and somehow Salafist groups right now have managed to keep their positions. They've gone back to their initial position. Well, we don't do politics, that's what they say. Only Salafis have a public presence with Sisi. If they do not enter politics, Sisi will leave them alone. And therefore, Salafis have kept their position in several countries with different activities. They also preach. But Muslim Brothers were a very strong group in Egypt in 2011. They had 2 million members in a country with a population of 6 million. That is a lot of support, and they also had a lot of supporters that were not members of the Muslim Brotherhoods. Obviously, their support is much less right now. We can't know their level of support because the Muslim Brotherhood is not present anymore socially. You cannot talk about Muslim brothers anymore. You would go to jail. So it is very difficult to know the popularity of a Muslim Brotherhood. Let's try to be brief in your questions, please. The microphone is not working. We need the speaker to use the microphone in order to interpret. The gentleman needs to turn on the microphone, please.
Fuerte contra los hermanos musulmanes, incluso.
There's been a relevant campaign against the Muslim Brotherhood in France, and Macron has spoken about this subject quite often. So, 4 countries have said that the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization, and therefore they are much more limited right now.
Hacia atrás, Catalina.
¿Cómo influye en este Islam político?
Regarding political Islam, what about the situation of Islam and the resurgence of Ayatollah Khomeini in connection with political Islam? I wanted to ask you if in the democratization process of Arab countries, other parties can have an influence, like the Ba'athi party you mentioned.
My only question is about the impact of this decline of Islamism, I would say, on Islamophobia. As we see, Islamophobia itself has been politicized in many countries, and some people are using it for their political campaigns. I would mention Eric Zemmour in France, and so on and so forth. So how would the decline of Islamism impact the raging, I would say, trend of Islamophobia? Thank you.
Vale, creo que el caballero que acaba de salir quería decir algo, pero...
I think the gentleman who just left the room wanted to say something, but, well, those questions are very relevant. The discussion about Muslim Brotherhood and violence is an old discussion. Professor Wali and I do not agree on this position. Myself and many other people consider that Muslim Brothers are not violent. They had violent periods when there was repression and there were violent actions. But Muslim Brotherhood as an organization is not a violent organization. But it depends on the circumstances, of course. This is an academic discussion, and it has also become a political discussion because since 2014, as you said, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates have carried out a campaign in order for the Muslim Brotherhood to be considered a terrorist organization. And this has repercussions in Europe. For example, in Saudi Arabia, the government launched an investigation in England in order to know if Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization. That investigation was not published, but the conclusion of that investigation was that Muslim Brotherhood is not a violent or a terrorist organization. But now Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and United Arab Emirates are not interested in this so-called scientific war. They just want to criminalize their positions, and therefore now we have a conflict between the use of this discussion and the discussion itself in the region and also outside of that region. And this has an impact in several situations. For example, considering your last question, Islamophobia in Europe, it is connected to what those states are doing right now. I'll give you a few examples. Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Assembly in France, she went to Egypt not many years ago, funded by United Arab Emirates in order to meet Sisi and the Sheikh. Those far right-wing parties are creating strong bonds with countries such as the United Arab Emirates, because if they promote Islamophobia, they also promote the idea that Muslim Brotherhood has to be criminalized because they are their political enemies. So everything is kind of interlinked. And therefore, we should not be naive. The discussion on violence is politicized. Muslim Brothers are progressive? No, they are not progressive. Sometimes we talk about social violence, and there can be ways and means of social violence, but they are not terrorists. And in the field on political science, we claim rightfully that they are not terrorists. So that terminology should not be applied to them. Then we have the campaign by Egypt and Saudi Arabia, which has an impact in many countries. In France, Salafis should be banned, as people say. And therefore, this is a topic, a relevant topic in European political campaigns. So the discussion we are having right now has consequences in different European countries. In France, we talk about this quite often. Iran. Iran is something different. We have a different situation there. It is a Shia country. We are talking about Sunni. First Sunnis and then Shias. If you look at history, Muslim Brotherhood appeared in the Sunni world in the 1920s. In the Shia world, they appeared in the 1950s. It is obvious why. Sunni Islam is very much linked to the idea of power, the caliphate. Shia were always a minority. They were waiting for the imam, for the hidden imam, so they have no space in order to build a political space. So what Khomeini did was to carry out a revolution. And many people didn't agree with him. They said, we should not do politics. We have to wait for the imam to come, the hidden imam, the Messiah. And therefore, what I mean by all this is that Islamism as an idea between religion and political was a natural idea for Sunnis because they had in mind the idea of the caliphate. That idea appeared in the Shia world in the 1950s because they had read the text by Hassan, the Dawa party in Iraq in the 1950s, would read those texts. And Khomeini, many Ayatollah of the time accused Khomeini of being Sunni. He wanted an Islamic state. So it is kind of contradictory, and Iran is an exception. Islamists managed to apply their project, and it was completely unexpected. And the impact is not so big because many of those groups consider Iran as a Shia country, but Muslim Brotherhood had links in the 80s with this country. But there was always this division between these two movements. Look at the situation in Syria, for example. The revolution in Syria. It was spearheaded by Shia and Sunni groups who went against Bashar al-Assad, supported by Iran. So Iran is sending militia to kill those people close to the Muslim Brothers. So they supported their ally, al-Assad. And therefore, everything is quite interlinked and quite complex. they are not in agreement just because they are Islamists.
¿Algo de esto?
Do you want to respond to that? Yes, if I may, I would just add a couple of facts in connection with some of the questions that were asked, particularly about women, because political Islam, for political Islam, women is essential in their writings, in their books, in their texts. For example, if we read a book by Sheikh Hassim, who was the founder of the Atwell Hassan group in Morocco, we will find that they have a completely traditional vision, or disastrous, we would say, for these days, because for them, of course, women should be completely dedicated to the traditional caregiving roles and procreation and so on, but it's not just, and childbearing and rearing, but it's not just him. Other leaders who've lived in the Western world, like Mr. Ghanouchi, when they were drafting the Tunisian constitution in 2014, they spent months and months debating Article 28, which had to do with the rights of women, because he was against giving Tunisian women equal rights, as women were demanding. And the same applies to other Islamist leaders, like Hassan Nasrallah, who has made statements that are pretty well known, like when he said that women have no place in politics and social media, for example. He was asking for women to stop posting photographs. And so I think that's pretty crucial. And in fact, it is one of the reasons why so many societies in the Islamic Arab world are against Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood or political Islam in general, because they are rooted in this well-known attitude. As for Islamophobia, of course Islamophobia is real, especially in the Western world, in the US, and in many other places. But I think sometimes we also confuse it with sound criticism, because it's not always Islamophobia when somebody wants to see a change or a reform and see the Islamic world evolve like other countries have done, accepting democracy and progress. You shouldn't always be quoting ancient texts, which are very respectable, of course, but they were rooted in a certain moment in time and are not particularly applicable today. As for Iran, that's the other school of Islam, which can also be defined as political Islam, and what the professor said is correct. But there are some nuances, because nowadays I would say that the biggest influence in the Middle East is Iran. Iran supported militias in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Iraq. There's no government. There are Iranian generals governing the country, and from Tehran, they follow Tehran's orders. And it's been 4 months since the elections in Iraq, and there's still no government, because the prime minister has to be approved by political power in Tehran. And some years ago, in the previous elections, it took 8 months, and the winning party was not able to appoint a prime minister. They appointed al-Maliki as prime minister, whose party actually was second in those elections. Well, thank you very much. We have very little time left. In fact, actually, we've run over, but there was one question which I could answer very quickly. What we've seen is that the Pan-Arab parties have not done well in the elections since 2011. Those parties have not gotten a lot of support. what we've seen about Islamists are sometimes, what we've seen in opposition to Islamists have been some left-wing parties, like in Egypt, for example. One of the biggest opposition parties for the Muslim Brotherhood was a left-wing party, so there's always the possibility of a left-wing reaction against the Islamic discourse, or liberals like Baradei. In Egypt, there was also Mohammed al-Baradei, who was someone of international repute. He was in the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and his ideology was politically and economically liberal. He was not in a pan-Arab party or a left-wing party, and I think that sort of ideology, like Baas and the pan-Arab parties, are also part of the past. And if Islamists have to evolve, so does counter-Islamists. They need to come up with a more modern alternative to Islamists. And Sisi is trying to do just that in Egypt. But of course, history tends to repeat itself, and the second time is a farce, and that's what we're seeing now with Sisi, who is now a sort of watered-down version of himself, of Nasser, and very different to his first terms. So that would be my answer. Those movements are currently not very popular, I would say, and so we cannot expect a resurgence. Our politics, I think, is also reinventing itself right now. Even the Islamists are having to evolve and reinvent themselves, as do all others. So we're seeing a lot of major changes, and those Arab Springs were also a turning point for this process. And in spite of all the efforts of the authoritarian regimes to stop this evolution, that evolution continues. Ultimately, people need to breathe and need to think, and you can't keep them quiet forever. Okay, well, with this final answer, we're going to close our session today. There's a couple of questions more that came into the YouTube channel. I'm just going to read them out, but we're not going to have time to answer them. But connected to this, somebody's asking whether we might not see a evolution towards more secular positions for Islamists by the younger generations, and if access to internet and to films and so on showing different lifestyle might not play a role in that. Well, I think we can leave that question, perhaps a very brief answer or comment. Yes, we are seeing some setting up an evolution. It's true that youth in the Arab world are different, which doesn't mean they're not religious, but they're religious in a different way. I think religion in the Arab world has a lot to do with identity, and that's why sometimes we tend to approach this issue of religion from a more European perspective. I think there will be more secular evolution in the Arab world, but it won't be copy of European secular states. It doesn't mean people are going to become atheists, but they will, I think, see religion differently. And you can tell that religion is changing in that world for the young, especially. 1 minute. 1 minute, okay. Well, actually, we've seen some statistics published by Western North American universities about the religious feeling in Arab countries, particularly in Egypt and even in Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And the data is pretty surprising, because currently there's a significant percentage who say they're atheists, not just not practicing, but atheists. In Egypt, 12%, which was a huge concern for Sisi, but also for Sheikh al-Azhar. They run a sort of campaign in Egypt to put a stop to this trend in Egypt. And all of this is definitely due to social media to a large extent. And that happened also in Saudi Arabia, even though much more secretly, because of course it's a lot harder in Saudi Arabia for somebody to openly state they're an atheist. And the same thing has happened in Iraq, and it was actually a big concern for Islamists and for the clergy, of course. Well, thank you very much for this comment, and I do think that it does complete that last comment on the evolution or the transformation that we're seeing, particularly since 2011, accelerating in the Arab countries with social change, which in many cases has very obvious political impacts, and in others, the more subtle changes, because of the closeness of some of these countries and the repression, we're not yet seeing its impact fully. But we're certainly doing our best at Casa Árabe in this institution with the help of experts to learn more about what's happening and understand better and follow trends in these countries. Thank you very much, Walid and Stéphane Lacroix, for being with us today. I want to thank all of you who've been following the lecture for your attention here and on YouTube. And we will continue very soon with more of these lectures. Next week, in fact, we have something on the banning of the niqab in the Netherlands, and the following week, something on prejudice and stereotypes in intercultural mediation. So do follow our channels, and see you very soon. See you next time.